just got a phone call from a friend in Florida. Peter Letterman passed away this morning.
Oh, man.
And it's ironic that we should be doing Timely Topics. Peter Letterman led Timely Topics for many, many years. So I'm sure, Bill, that you'll want to make an announcement to all of the members next week, but that's fresh news. Well, today's session is, should the federal government give aid to the states? And that's a very broad topic, and I'm sure we can do with what we wish to do with it. But I'd like to just begin with a comment from the internet. Overarching is the evolving nature of cultural norms and expectations concerning government's role in American society. Over time, the American public has become increasingly accepting of government activism in domestic affairs generally, and of federal government intervention in particular. Federalism scholars attribute this increased acceptance and sometimes demand for government action as a reaction to the industrialization and urbanization of American society, technological innovations in communications, which have raised awareness of societal problems, and exponential growth in economic interdependence brought about by an increasingly global economy. With that, I'd welcome your comments.
I'll comment.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ken.
Hello, you got me?
Hi,
Yes,
Ken.
Ken.
I thought you were going to talk. I was going
It's
to.
Ken Lindhorst. Is that okay?
Yep, go Ken. Yes, we can.
I think the question is not the right question. I think the question is, should the U.S. government fund things that stimulate the economy? And the second part of it would be, another way to look at it is, should they help in disasters? As opposed to say, should the government fund to rehabilitate hurricane survivors? The real issue is not helping states, it's whether or not it's going to undermine the economy if the states go bankrupt and can't, or have to fire their police and their EMS people. And is this really any different than providing money to states who have to rebuild roads when there's a hurricane that they had no control over? It's a natural disaster. Is the pandemic a natural disaster that states had no control over? How is it different from any disaster in terms of funding? So those are the two ideas I have. And obviously the bottom line is, yes, they should, because it is a natural disaster over which states had no control. They do it if there's a hurricane. And in any event, the more prevailing question is, will this help stimulate the economy in a time when the economy is in bad shape?
Nolan, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was going to, and I'll make two comments. One is a little off topic, but I think it's very, very important. I guess I'll go there first. How did the presidents of the United States become almost dictatorial in their powers? There are only three branches of government. We'll leave the judiciary out. So we have the legislative and the executive. Power abhors a vacuum. Congress has the sole right to declare war. The last time they declared war was in 1941, Pearl Harbor. Congress fails miserably to do just about anything. So what you have really, ever since Franklin D. Roosevelt, if not earlier, is presidents beginning to fill the void. When Congress is incapable or unwilling or cannot perform, they have tended to expand their authority. So the term imperial presidency began to show up in the 1960s. And I think the power of the presidency has gotten greater and greater and greater. I'll just throw that out as a side topic we could pursue or not pursue. I think that's very important. Now, as the federal government giving money to the states, you saw the census, right? They're all doing the census right now. How do you want that $800 billion of federal money to be distributed? They're talking about distributing $800 billion a year right now, forgetting about anything else. So I think it's clear the federal government is supporting the states and localities with massive amounts of money. The question I guess we're talking about is, should we turbocharge that to an even higher level? I'm done.
Bill, you had a question, comment?
Yeah, I'd like to suggest that we try to use the raise hand system to give this discussion some
Structure?
some structure. That's okay. And also, we have the challenge that Ken raised an issue, and then Nolan's raising a different issue. So I don't know. But what I want to respond to the first two. Ken, should they stimulate the economy? Ironically, I've heard some comments of concern that the federal government, they certainly should help and have saved us in a number of times recently of disaster. But it can get to be a point where individuals are offloading their own personal responsibility of financial, saving money for a rainy day and stuff like that. Well, the government will take care of it. There's a risk in the borrowing we're doing and whatnot. So that's the reaction to Ken. The reaction to Nolan, I think from the very beginning, there was a back and forth about a imperial presidency versus states' rights and federalism and all the rest of it. So, I do have concerns about an imperial presidency, especially with the guy that's sitting in the seat right now. But I think it's a universal back and forth. Over.
Could I get a chance?
Sure.
Yeah, I thought that this discussion is not really about disasters. I mean, disasters are not at the state level. And it's not about saving for a rainy day, because what's happening now pretty much had nothing to do with anybody saving for a rainy day. And it's not about presidential power either. What it's about is that for reasons that are totally beyond the control of the states, their revenues are severely depleted. And well, if you want to bend the definition and call that a disaster, you can, but it's a national disaster. And if a number of our states simply run out of money, well, they won't run out of money. They'll do exactly what our Governor Murphy said, which is that they'll just cut a lot of things that we all need. The states cannot print money like the federal government. And I guess a different discussion would be concerning deficit spending and all that. But there's no question that there's a huge hole, a financial hole that needs to be refilled. And there's only one conceivable way that that can be done, and that is with federal funding. And I would just add one more thing. In the 1970s, there was something called revenue sharing, which was a gigantic program of taking federal revenues and distributing them among the states. And this was not considered to be, aid for disasters. It was considered to be a normal part of our federal system. Thank you.
Horst?
Yeah. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, Haas,
Can you hear me?
we can hear you.
Okay. Hi. Yeah,
I can't hear him. His
No, I
voice is
can't.
breaking up. Do you hear him clearly is the question.
One,
I can't hear him either.
this is the
Haas, excuse me, but how does he sound to everybody? To me
He's
and
breaking
Nolan,
up.
he's completely breaking up and
Breaking up.
I cannot understand.
I cannot hear him at all.
Okay.
I cannot hear him really.
But turning down into
Haas, you have to fix your sound.
All right. In the meantime, Larry
Okay.
Cunningham, why don't you take over?
Sorry.
Larry?
I guess we're waiting for Haas anyway.
I'm gonna pass.
As far as the first question, it's imperative that the federal government provide money to avoid, this economic situation getting into a depression. I think it's been quite recognized by a lot of different people in the banking industry that had the Federal Reserve been more active in 1929, 1930, 1932, they might have avoided the depression going on for another decade after that. So I think that's imperative. That's one of the main things that the Federal Reserve looks at as their responsibility. Now, how they do it and how much money is out there, and what are the obligations and who is it directed toward, I think there's probably going to be a lot of debate on that particularly. With regards to the states, yeah, you would think that it would make some sense for the federal government to provide some money to the states, but that's also, complicated by, each state's budgeting situation. I don't quite remember exactly because I'm a Midwesterner from birth, but I seem to recall that like I think it was in the mid to late 60s, New York City almost got bankrupt as a result of under Beam as the mayor. Do you guys recall whether they received any federal funding to get out of that hole?
Gerald Ford to New York City, dropped dead. That
Okay.
was the response in 1974 of the federal government to New York City, dropped dead.
Do you recall how New York got out of that pickle that they were in?
Long, difficult, painful, violent, criminal progress.
We actually put a very savvy financial guy, Felix Royatin, in charge of restoring New York
Okay.
City's finances. One of the reasons New York City got into such trouble was that they were actually borrowing to cover their operating costs, a total absence of fiscal discipline. By the way, that was not what Ford said to New York City. That was the headline in the New York Daily News when they were paraphrasing the fact that Ford was not too anxious to give any aid to New York City.
Thanks, Steve. Mitch Erickson?
Yeah, hi. I just want to put two things out there. First of all, like it or not, this has been declared a federal disaster. And under the federal disaster rules, something called the Stafford Act, there's a whole world of things that happen. The difference between this disaster and, say, Sandy is, number one, the response phase is going along at a much slower pace than we normally expect in a disaster. We're months into this thing and we're still responding. We're not actually recovering yet. And the second thing is, because it doesn't have any buildings torn down or forest fires or whatever, it's hard to relate at a visceral level to the fact that, yes, this is a disaster. And that whole mechanism of the Stafford Act has kicked in a long time ago, and FEMA, we heard the guy from FEMA here over a month ago now. Anyway, that's just an aside. A couple of things. First of all, I think fundamentally the question we ask ourselves is, do we want to save our society? Do we want to invest and make sure that we don't go down various bad routes that we really don't want to go down? And, the details of which those are is something for a long, debate. And the second piece of what I want to say is that keep in mind there's no real government to say, so to speak. The federal government and the state governments are us. We are the ones who will get the benefits sooner or later from the spending that originates out of the federal government creating money. Now, how that gets dribbled down and whether it goes to the states is, I wouldn't say detail, but it ultimately ends up answering the same question of where do we want to save America? And to the extent that there's a whole lot of things that we already passed through, all of the normal things that deal with the poor and the sick tend to get passed through the states anyway. Food stamps or SNAP, those are administered at the state and the county level. So which government hands it out is not as important as how we hand it out and how we protect the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of our citizens. So, the mechanisms are already there for the feds to hand down big chunks of money for everything from helping the poor to all of the road taxes get handed out to the states. The federal government has never laid a mile of asphalt. They always give it to the states. Enough from me. Anyway, point being, do we want to save our society?
Steve Varley?
This has been an unmitigated disaster. The coronavirus, followed by the lockdown, has caused a horrible economic situation. But you should be aware of the fact that in the original stimulus plan, the one that cost roughly $3 trillion, there was some 535 billion that was allocated to the states and to localities. So it's not a matter of whether we should be giving that money, but how much money we might need. But we've started off with a fair chunk of money, $500 billion. I happen to believe we probably need more, but I do have a concern. And the concern is that by giving huge amounts of additional money without some safeguards, we are only encouraging an awful lot of states and localities that are already, financially poorly equipped to handle their existing deficits. I don't know if you all read the editorial in yesterday's New York Times, but it was kind of fascinating because the Times editorial board literally was going after de Blasio over his lack of fiscal discipline. Interestingly, he's proposed to borrow almost $7 billion to cover operating costs, which is the very problem that got New York City into trouble in the 1970s. And we're also, of course, well aware of what's happened with pension funding in Illinois and New Jersey, among other places. So, yep, I do think we need additional dollars going toward the states and localities, but what kind of safeguards can we build in that this doesn't relieve our politicians of their obligation to step up to the plate and understand that there may be areas where you can make significant cuts. Interestingly, the editorial in yesterday's New York Times talked about cuts in 3 areas: the police, education, and the enormous number of consultants being used by New York City. Those would be good places to start.
Steve, this is Mort. Do you think that you can cut back on education expenses, or will that lead to more of the problems that we're seeing right now?
I think you have to fine tune in the area of education, Mort. I mean, some of the expenditures there, clearly we don't want to cut back. you know, there's an enormous, you know, bureaucracy and infrastructure in education. And it's not just in New York City, it's throughout the country, obviously. That might be a logical place to start.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think Al has his hand up.
Al, you have the
Yeah. I agree with a number of the comments that have been made. My real concern is who will get the aid. My worry about the federal government and the governments in general today is that they represent the will of the lobbyists and not often the will of the people. So when we talk about the federal government or state governments, who is actually representing the interests of the federal government and the state governments? It's not always the people.
Good point. And John Tomaszewski has his hand up.
Yeah, we're all talking about taking money from education, but when you look at the slice of pie where the federal funding goes, which always has bothered me, more than 50% of it goes towards the military. It's like that old joke where if they want to buy a new missile, they got to have a cookie sale, where education gets a very small slice if you look at the total. And I've always thought, why are we spending so much money on military? I know we need a strong military, but do we have to police every action that goes on in the world? And if we cut that back, we could put more money into the communities and maybe have the same type of system where we can invest in the police departments for a little more education and let them hire a higher standard of people. Just a thought.
Mitch is next.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to throw one thing out there that to me is an opposer. Let's just say that. Do we bail out the airlines and do we bail out Boeing? The lack of travel in the last while has just, I mean, the financial ruin among the major airlines and Boeing is just huge. And on one end, I just say, well, tough. You guys are big companies and you'll figure it out. But on the other hand, a world without United Airlines, American Airlines, and Boeing would be something that I'm not sure I want to ponder. So on the one hand, you really don't want to, bail out these companies that are big and they have finance and so forth. And as Al mentioned, but they've got the lobbyists in Washington. But on the other hand, if you want to go visit somebody in San Francisco here in 2022, you got to have an airline. So just a thought.
Fred Honnold.
Fred, you got to unmute yourself. Okay.
Coming through?
Yep, come through.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mort, for orchestrating. Your question has raised a lot of other questions appropriately. And the other night I was reading back through the Revolutionary War and the Constitution, and the mention of a cluster of geniuses, Franklin, Madison, Hamilton, Washington, who really faced a lot of odds and came up with an experiment that has been phenomenal. But like any institution, the people that have gotten involved running it seem to have a different purpose. And I think at this point, it would be healthy and helpful to reimagine what our republic is about. This whole bit of defunding police at first shocked me and alarmed me. That's the thin blue line that stands between us and the rest of the world out there. But I happened to catch the former police chief of Camden on television just last night, being interviewed. And he was talking about how Camden was defunded and all the police had to reapply with a 50-page application, but they chose a different conceptual model. Rather than a military force, they thought about a Peace Corps. And they thought about a Peace Corps that works inside Camden. And not unsurprisingly, Camden has had no protests or no riots because the purpose of government is working there. I had lived in DC off and on during my career. I'd get up early in the morning, 5:30, there'd be a bunch of lobbyists there, all with their tasseled loafers on, and they'd be heading up by bus at 6 a.m. up to the Hill. The point is a lot happens behind the scene that we probably sense but we're not aware of. And so you come back full circle, and you say, really, it's a morass the way government exists, or the purpose of government to grow government with a lot of insiders playing. And I guess the question is, how do we all get involved, ventilate it, get transparency, demand transparency, and in the thick of that, put in term limits. The cluster of geniuses in the revolutionary times were there for a purpose, and then they went back to what they did best. People today, for some odd reason, want to stay in power and do not want to cultivate the next generation. So I think, again, an excellent question that probably is a lot of our minds, and it'd be interesting for us as a group to kind of coalesce around what next.
Thanks, Fred. Ken is up next.
Yes, my earlier comments were based on my perception that we were talking about, or that the issue was whether or not federal government should reimburse states and local governments for the expenses that they provided to basically address the pandemic. And I think that the answer to that is yes, because I think it's a national problem. In fact, it's an international problem. If you don't curb a virus, it will spread. I mean, the most recent studies show that if those who had the pandemic raging in their area had not taken the steps they took, we'd have 500,000 more deaths. And it comes back to, it is really a national problem, and what we're talking about is, should the national government address the actions of government, of states and local, where they were addressing the national problem of a pandemic that would have spread further and further if those governments, that is the state governments, hadn't taken the actions they did. So, I mean, there's 1,000 ways to look at this, but if in fact what happened was something that wasn't the fault of the states and something they did which was reacting to a national problem that was spreading everywhere else, I think it makes sense to fund it. That's it.
Thank you, Ken. Nolan is back.
Nolan, you have to unmute. We can't hear you.
Okay, just to be brief and not go off topic, as I'm afraid I once did, I very much support what Ken just said and what Mark just said. To me, it's a no-brainer. The federal government must, should, and is the best interest of the country for them to come to the rescue, just as if this was a hurricane or a flood or a tornado, but this is worse and it's causing more damage. I very much support what Fred said, knowing a lot about Washington, having been in Washington. Lobbyists and corruption have been in the United States almost since day one, and I have no brilliant idea about what to do with it. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Nolan.
Mark Edelman.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that, you know, the problem before us is concerning the federal government giving money to state governments, which is not education, it's not disaster aid, it's not any of those things. It's trying to make up for the emergency shortfalls that state governments have right now, which is why I think Nolan is absolutely right that it's a no-brainer. The problem, of course, is that in Congress, this is seen as in partisan terms, and there are a lot of accusations right now, and I think they have a lot of merit, that the federal agencies are playing favorites among the states.
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of obvious that they are.
They are.
So, that's why I hearkened back to 1970s when we had revenue sharing, which worked by a formula. And the reason it had a formula was that made it nonpartisan. At any rate, I think that's what we need right now. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Steve?
Steve, you're unmuted.
Oops.
We hear you, Steve.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, I thought I was still muted. I agree with the thoughts regarding lobbyists, but let's also remember that our politicians can, on their very own, create an enormous amount of waste. I'm reminded of years ago when Senator Russell was head of the Senate Armed Forces Committee in the Senate. He steered an enormous amount of military spending to his own state. In fact, one wag once said that if another military base is placed in Georgia, that state will sink into the Atlantic. So be aware that it's our lobbyists, but it's also our politicians. In both cases, we need a lot more fiscal discipline in terms of spending the limited funds that we have wisely.
Paul, are you?
Yeah, just one small comment. It's not just the politicians in Congress, but I remind you that President Trump delayed the sending out of the stimulus checks in order to make sure that his name appeared on every check because it's an election year.
It's politicians across the board, Paul.
Yes.
And Fred, Fred wants to make a comment?
Yes, Mort. To your originating question, you figure what is the level of the issue, and it is a federal level, it's a global issue in terms of this pandemic. So it says that, yes, the government must step in. The question then, I guess, is how does the government step in? And if you think about a lot of things that get announced and then they go into the ether, for example, all the tax cuts were supposed to be for corporations to invest back in infrastructure and jobs. How much money actually reached there versus how much went back into stock buybacks? You come back into here, there's an announcement of all this money. Where's it all going? And it would be interesting, I think, for people to demand of the politicians, because politicians are most sensitive to the vote count, is further tracking of where all this money goes. Some years back, there was a big discussion about Google for government and everything would be transparent. And I haven't heard anything about that since. But if you could see it originating, 500 billion for corporations, be interesting if any and all of us, along with the rest of the citizens, could hop on Google and see this is where the money's going. Now, will that ever happen? Probably not. But boy, the politicians are certainly sensitive to the vote. If that was made an issue, then it becomes an issue.
Thank you. Walter Meisner?
Yes, I wanted to make a comment to the earlier comment about defunding police and everything. I remember reading an article in the Parade magazine, which is the Sunday supplement in the newspaper back in the 70s. And they were talking about how the crime rate was so low in Japan and so high in the US. And they talked about how the Japanese system works. And basically, like in a city, police would have, an individual policeman would have their beat, and they, you know, it would be maybe a couple blocks or whatever it is, and they would get to know every resident in every building and every apartment and introduce themselves and get to know who the family is and who the members are. And they would periodically, you know, check in on them, you know, month by month, you know, as if they were a neighbor. And so if suddenly a son wasn't going to school and, you know, he would know about it and he would try to help the family out by, you know, getting public services involved, you know, to see, you know, what the problem is and all that kind of stuff. And the conclusion to this article was, well, this would never work in the United States because A, the culture is different, and the, you know, and the right to privacy and all that kind of stuff, or invasion of privacy. And, you know, I thought that was kind of interesting because, you know, if I look at some of the film clips, you know, I recently saw something on PBS that talked about Newark from a couple of years ago, maybe it was a decade ago, and somebody rode with the police, and what they were doing is it was a gang unit, and they're trying to keep guns off the street, and they would literally just, if they saw people and they were running, they would assume they were running for a reason, that they were suspicious, and they would, you know, get out of their cars and, you know, wrestle them to the ground and check them out. And 75% of them were never, you know, they were innocent people. And so, you know, it generates a us versus them attitude, versus what the Japanese had done is to have the police talk to every resident and get to know them and, you know, get to be on their side.
Thank you, Walt. Larry again?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention two items. I think the biggest failure our forefathers had in putting everything together was the lack of limits. And the probably best example of that is, I remember probably about a decade ago, there was an article on 60 Minutes, and they were interviewing a guy by the name of Senator Robert Byrd. And the reason he was on 60 Minutes is because 60 Minutes had determined that in West Virginia, they had the highest federal spending per capita of the states in the Union. Now, one would think of West Virginia, in most places, if you drive through there, as being very poor, very backward, doesn't do any international business or anything. Here they are with, you know, all the money that Senator Byrd moved their way. And why was that? Because he was the number one, number two person in terms of dealing with money. So I don't think anybody in the forefathers had in their right mind that people would be there for life. But that would be certainly it would be helpful. Now that won't take care of the immediate problem with the pandemic, but at least that's got to be looked at going forward, I think. Otherwise, we end up with lifers and we end up with people who don't really represent the people anymore. The second thing I was going to mention, and I don't know for those of you in Berkeley Heights, but apparently, you know, there's some people call it redlining, some people call it different things, but if you ever pay attention, when you get off Route 78 at exit 43, the first one going from Newark, and you drive up Diamond Hill Road, just before you get to the intersection at Mountain Drive, there's always usually a Berkeley Heights or a New Providence police car sitting in the parking lot just before that one Chubb building. And why is that? You know what they're doing? They're basically looking at license plates, and they do a check of any license plate coming into Berkeley Heights at that location. And when they see somebody who's got an Essex ownership or a different county or Camden or whatever, they very likely will pull them over. I have my daughter-in-law's parents actually live in Short Hill, so they have an Essex County ownership. And they were actually coming to my son's house, which is in Berkeley Heights, and they actually got pulled over. Now, of course, there wasn't any issues or anything there, but still, it's it could be viewed as being quite oriented or negative towards certain presumptions about where the problems are. But in the same token, the Berkeley Heights police would tell you that they're the biggest thing that they can do to keep violence and get crime off the streets in Berkeley Heights is to control who's coming in. So there you have it. Enough.
Thank you, Larry.
Yep.
Anyone else? Fred again?
Nolan raised an interesting question earlier off of your question, Mort, about how did the executive become so powerful? And it's kind of stunning when you look at what appears to be dictatorial power. Even suddenly withdrawing troops out of Germany, 25%, or things with treaties. And I think in the Constitution, it even says that the Congress is responsible for the treaties or declaring war. But if you go back into the movie Vice, that was Sam Rockwell and Christian Bale playing Bush and Cheney. In that movie, there is some lawyer who probably got nothing but 4.0 or 5.0 through school, who goes back deep into the archives and begins to come up with documentation about these powers of the president and that they can act in that way. Now, we understand that in times of war, but it seems like, let me just punctuate with an opinion. I think what is happening now with all this chaos is the best thing that could happen. And the overreaching is the best thing that could happen. And I say that because when people can keep things quiet and behind the scenes, like a magician, they get away with a lot. But now that it's out in front, people are finally stepping up and taking action. And people then will start to question, how did the president become so powerful to act unilaterally? And if you want us to believe that movie, it was Cheney that was behind it, that was overreaching and became the president behind the scenes. Look at things that Kushner is doing, acting like a prime minister without any responsibility. And so I think when things happen like this, it is a flashpoint for people to suddenly become aware and then take action. And so to the originating question, the federal government has to step up to this disaster. The question is how they step up, and in that old Latin phrase, cui bono, who benefits? Are they using this disaster to benefit themselves or to benefit the people? What is it, of the people, by the people, for the people, I think is the opening lines.
Thanks, Fred. John Tomaszewski?
Yeah, I was just thinking, Congress makes a lot of these laws and then they demand that the states implement them and usually end up having to pay for a good chunk of what they decided that the state should do. And I don't know, I just think that should fit into this equation of whether they should fund the states.
Okay. Jim Blinn?
Yes, well, let's see, am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you, Jim.
Thank you. So, yes, I wanted to concur with some of the comments earlier about allocation of money from the federal government to the states. What I have heard requested by, I think, both Cuomo and Murphy, and makes a lot of sense, is, gee, you really ought to think about allocating the money for the crisis to the states that have had the problems, that have had to spend the most money. Alaska and Montana and Hawaii don't really need all that much money to cover their costs for the crisis compared to states like New York and New Jersey and Illinois, California, and so forth. So somehow using that kind of an allocation formula for this money would seem to make so much common sense, it's hard to believe Congress would actually do it.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
Rich Jager?
It's hard to follow Jim Blynn's last comment about that reasonable proposal makes too much sense for Congress to do it, but I'll try to follow anyway. I find myself agreeing with, I'll say, everything that our various participants have said, and it's covered a lot of different aspects. The thought that I have is I really don't think we've solved any problems simply by throwing money at the problem. I suppose there are examples, there may even be counterexamples, but I think there are more examples. For decades, the Newark schools were an example of you throw money at it and it doesn't get any better. So there needs to be things done that are reasonable and sensible. You know, it would be nice. Maybe the federal government should pause a little bit and think before they throw another couple of trillion to the states and perhaps indirectly to the municipalities. I think the idea of a formula, which has been used in the past, is probably a good idea, because that would be transparent. That would be something that would be out there, and the reporters could report on it, and it wouldn't be you know, obviously the formula came from somewhere, but it would be sort of clear, you know, who's being given the money, and questions could be asked as to you know, okay, Senator, why did you vote for that? You know, maybe a little bit of a pause and a good formula that is transparent would help us, but I'm leery of just throwing money at it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mitch?
Yeah, one of the things, the concept that I've been writing about and I've been talking with the TUG guys about is the new normal. We will not go back to January 2020 after this is all over. We will go to a new normal. And what does that mean? And I would suggest just maybe get a sense of everybody, but more, maybe another one of these timely topics might be, what do we want the new normal to look like? Because we have some vote in how we manufacture that new normal through the taxes, through the government bailouts, and through our own habits. Just one simple example. None of us has gone to a movie theater in the last 2 months. When the things all open up, are you going to go to a movie theater? Are you going to just say, oh, I found Netflix and it's just fine for me. I can sit right here and eat my own popcorn. That's such a little teeny piece of the whole puzzle. But, you know, what new habits will we have? What new ways do we want our country to go? So maybe, you know, just a thought, if anybody wants to have that kind of conversation. Mort?
I think you're right. Will we shake hands in the new normal? Or will we say namaste?
Or live long and prosper.
Anyone else? Well, thanks everyone for your contribution to the discussion today. I think we covered a lot of ground, and we've raised possible points of discussion for the next time. Thank you very much. Joel, thank you for acting as our moderator.
Thank you, Mort.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Mort.
All right.
Yeah, thanks, Mort.
Take care.
Thank you.